So thank you. Really appreciate the opportunity to meet with you today. As, as Francois mentioned, I'm Dr. Elizabeth Lawler. I'm here from Boston. I'm here to talk about DevOps compliance and security working in unison. In other words, it's compliance for people who hate the word compliance. Let me tell you a little bit about myself and why I'm here. I got into cybersecurity after a career in actually public health research. I have a doctorate of epidemiology and biostatistics. And I worked for 15 years in regulated and compliant data systems, building IT systems and software to do medical research. And so some of the things that turn me on are providing better security-related experiences for businesses. I'm really interested in access controls at scale for robots and machines. And I'm also a big fan of my husband, kids, dog, cat, and chickens. So why would a public health person get involved in cybersecurity? I was a programmer. I worked in electronic medical record data systems. And in 2006, I was working at the US Department of Veterans Affairs. So this is a slide from Information is Beautiful. It shows, I don't know if you've seen this graphic before, it's the biggest breaches by year. And at the time, the Department of Veterans Affairs lost 26 million Social Security numbers and pieces of personally identifiable information off of someone's laptop. And that was a galvanizing experience for me. That could have happened to anyone in my research group. It could have happened to a lot of people that I worked with. We basically had unfettered access to incredibly sensitive information at the time. And so around the time of 2006, I started getting interested in cybersecurity. Well, but I think it's evident that we're in the middle of an epidemic now of cybersecurity events and breaches. So if you fast forward from 2006, we were sort of like the bad kid on the block back then, but now look what happens. So this is, the next 10 years of cybersecurity events. Huge, massive hacks, tons of data lost. Recently, Yahoo was in the news for the 500 million records that were lost. So, cybersecurity events are growing at a CAGR, compound annual growth rate, of 48% a year. This is a huge problem for business worldwide. And it represents a threat not only to the data that we're talking about here, but it represents a threat to reputation, to brand, to shareholder value, regulatory risk, and it erodes faith in organizations. So one of my recent breaches that I was unfortunately a victim of was this one, the US Office of Personnel Management. They stole 15 years of records of people who had been vetted by the FBI to work for the US government. And so that felt really personal, right? Like, that's more than just my credit card and social security number. It's all about me and everybody that I knew and everyone that the FBI had interviewed so I could work at the VA. So this is becoming real. It's really starting to impact our lives, right, at a very personal level. And really what's driving all this is the rapid growth of data. So right now I think we have 7 or almost 8 zettabytes of data out there in the world that's being stored by various kinds of companies and businesses. It's going to grow to 35 zettabytes. How many people know what a zettabyte is? How much is a zettabyte? 1 million petabytes. But you're close. I mean, it's huge, just vast amounts of data that's being collected worldwide through all kinds of systems. And we, people, consumers, are responsible for creating 70% of that data. But companies, enterprises, often regulated groups and businesses are responsible for maintaining the security of 80% of that data. So it's our data, but other people have to secure it. And it's coming from everywhere. So the number of at-risk connections is just increasing at an exponential rate. And it's getting more and more heterogeneous where information is coming from. So for example, IoT is something like a $2.5 trillion industry. It's expected to grow to 15 trillion by 2020. And these are all systems that collect information through software that's of material value, right? It's everything from my banking and account information to my refrigerator to my car. All of this is connected by software and backs data. So the problem here, and the reason why this event is so important, is that DevOps is the next iteration of how we're going to be able to manage and secure and control and comply with regulation in this new, fast-moving, huge, giant-scale world. And the fact of the matter is we can really no longer rely on people to be able to keep up with the pace of security needs. We need to automate. The problem in rolling out security, especially in highly regulated environments, and so how many of you work in a highly regulated environment? Banking, healthcare? Yeah, so you probably know that most things that are sensitive are provisioned still by people. Things like access, credentials, onboarding, et cetera. And the way that those systems were designed was with controls that were essentially accountable to people. But as we move into these high velocity IT systems, cloud, DevOps, IoT, we're talking about, hundreds to millions of system components. They're moving really fast. The average life expectancy of a container is less than 3 days. You can no longer use people in those processes. So you have to do something different. In addition, security gets spread across lots of different tools. So you have a widely interconnected group of systems of which you could have configuration management, you have multi-cloud systems, you have all sorts of different platforms that you're using. And so the concerns sort of shift from insider threat and physical damage or physical or environmental risks to data to things like tampered code, hijacked systems, compromised puppet servers, for example. These are the new threat surface that the business is thinking about when we're moving to these new systems. So in a containerized cloud environment, you really have to think about how you can automate and systematize some of the controls that might be necessary for your business. So unless you're really red teaming your systems every day, it's very hard to find all of the potential connection points that could potentially be compromised without putting some sort of automated systems in place. But you can't slow down. So, DevOps has been proven to provide tremendous business value and competitive advantage to the companies who adopt it. So this is here. This is coming. DevOps is here. Being able to move at velocity represents, improved customer experiences, faster time to market. Automation delivers real value. So as software developers and as system administrators and as DevOps or Sec people, we have embraced the sort of organizational, methodological, and technological changes that come with this type of system, right? Agile, DevOps organizations. So we've won the day. This is definitely being adopted across different kinds of industries. But the grand prize for that is that now everyone's looking at you. They're looking at your systems. They're looking at what you're doing. They want to know that the business is safe and secure using these high velocity tools. And so compliance is like the booby prize for getting where you are. So now we're taking all of these systems and they're coming under the sort of lens of risk and compliance and increasingly the business lens of risk and compliance for various brands. So the first step was to sort of get all the systems aligned, tame the monsters, get going on this fast continuous delivery pathway, which allows incremental change and faster time to value. But then the security folks showed up. So DevOps is the portmanteau of development and operations. Now it's SecDevOps. Eventually it will be compliance, biz, value SecOps or something. The SecOps people showed up, and this is what they saw. So you've set up your CI/CD pipeline, you've got everything rolling, you've got really great uptime, all your metrics are awesome. And then the security people or the compliance people looked at it and said, oh man, so we've got infrastructure code developers putting credentials in GitHub, get phished admin creds that could compromise this whole entire platform. Somebody could potentially side channel IT resources for Bitcoin mining. I have actually seen this happen, in one organization we worked with. People are worried about out-of-date libraries, malware injections, the whole 9 yards. So this represents a huge threat surface that companies now are worried about compromising their business. And the more tailored your pipelines are, if you have, there's kind of two different ways of doing this, having many different pipelines or having one Uber pipeline for your business. If you have one Uber pipeline for your business, this is your business in a nutshell. And it's sitting there waiting to be compromised or used in ways you weren't necessarily anticipating. So Josh Corman, who's one of the founding team members of Sonatype. Who's here from Sonatype? I know there's Sonatype people downstairs. Anybody? Okay. He talks about the software delivery pipeline and the fact that, basically we've come up with regulations and requirements for supply chain to make quality products for things that really make a difference in our lives, right? Like cars, medical devices, etc. This software, owing to all that data and all those connected devices that are all touching our lives, now really needs to be looked at through the same kind of lens of delivering quality products and secure, essentially, supply chain for the next generation of software products. So he says, building your solutions at the highest level of quality means they can handle adverse circumstances, of which cybersecurity threats are one source of those types of adverse circumstances. So now that I sort of, questions, comments, thoughts? So now that I've laid out sort of where the business is looking and what they're concerned about and how this momentum is all sort of coming around DevOps and DevOps pipelines, it's like, where do you begin? It's so huge. What should I do? Should I just start on a credential hunt? Do I need to rethink my pipeline? What's the next step here? So I think we can all agree that security is everybody's job. I mean, we're working inside of our organizations to shift security left early in the software development process, getting security folks involved with DevOps early on in software design. Security, having security early on in the process reduces technical debt, prevents rework, less time writing code. Embedded security also improves consistency across software products. So how does compliance play into this? Compliance is basically the demonstration that you have trustworthy practices at work inside of your organization building critical things like software products. And demonstrating that, proving that you have security controls in place, proving that you are reducing risk for the business is the goal of any kind of compliance or regulatory framework. So bringing compliance in early in the process to define what's in scope, what's not in scope, et cetera, for regulatory controls is actually very similar to bringing Sec into the software delivery process early on. So the first step one is unify your team, your engineering team, your ops team, your Sec team with compliance. Because they're just wondering, can we trust these people? I don't trust that guy. So, like all good software, start with a story, right? Meet the compliance team. Part of every project where you're designing or deploying a new system of workflow, you should go to compliance early and ask them, is this potentially in spec or in scope for regulation for my business? It's surprising how little, I was talking with someone earlier, it's surprising how many people don't really know whether their application might potentially have a regulatory impact or not, especially in small business. It's worth it to hire experts or have a network of experts that you can reach out to ask. Gather requirements and plan it into the project from the beginning. So who's your compliance officer? Well, it could be a business owner, right? Someone who owns responsibility for the risk to the business. What if my system's attacked and we have reputational damage? What if, in the case of Yahoo, what if it's going to impact a merger and acquisition? I have a friend who's a compliance officer, and when people see her coming down the hall, they close their doors and hide under the desks. They don't want to talk to this person. I found that, especially in complex organizations, if you can just find the person who owns risk and compliance for your business and take them out to lunch and ask them what's on their mind, what's worrying them, start a rapport, get them involved, it's actually the easiest path to determining what you really need to focus on and what can be saved for later. So lunch, simple. It's a great tool to get insights. So, you've met your compliance officer. Then, start with a persona map of your organization. You've got your compliance owner, the business owner. They're concerned that the security strategy is aligned with business and compliance goals. You've got your security folks. They want to have, they've often been in the position of watching rather than doing. They want to get involved and be able to help you design key controls that will mitigate prevalent or high-risk events to the business. Ops people often view audit and compliance and security as unplanned work, right? So what you don't want to do is come back after a particular process or throw an audit at someone and they're like, oh man, now this is going to take 2 weeks out of my time. I had all these other projects I needed to do. My whiteboard is already filled and I have to do this audit thing. They don't want to have, complex audit-driven processes that simply don't scale. And then developers, often don't think about compliance and maybe potentially security at all in the development process. They're just trying to get the feature out the door because that's what they're being measured against. So you just want to make sure that whatever workflow you're putting in place isn't going to impact their flow. So the more difficult it is to enforce policy across all these different stakeholders, the more difficult it will be to meet your audit and regulatory and compliance requirements. And then finally, for developers particularly, there's always this pull toward, the next new thing. What's the next new thing that's going to help us build a great software product? What's the next new thing that's going to help my career as a developer? And, I remember when my engineers were like, hey, let's all do Go. Yeah, that's great, but we also need to be able to ensure that we're securing whatever platform tools, Docker, Kubernetes, they change their mind all the time, that they're bringing on board. And so, one of the things that you have to deal with in a SecDevOps, framework is that you need to be able to onboard heterogeneous tools that drive business without creating process problems that prevent people from bringing them on. So the process of certifying applications for deployment, for example, in large complex organizations can often be a very kind of hand-driven process. Well, how are you going to do that when you've got lots of new tools coming on board all the time, right? What we're trying to do is create strategies that work across the business that anticipate future tooling that people will be wanting to bring on that don't also cause a bottleneck or a people-based process that slows everything down. Because what you don't want to end up with is organizational strife, right? You can end up in these situations where the security people become sort of the department of no. And the operations people say, well, we're not even going to try that because it's just going to fail and we're not going to get it done and the project's not going to go anywhere. And then the developers feel frustrated, right? Like you see this tension going on inside of businesses all the time, kind of a defeatist attitude towards security and compliance. Whereas if you get everybody together at the beginning, you find out where the hot button issues are, hot topics, and then you work toward essentially something that everybody can find acceptable. Because ultimately this is all about risk. And finding balance between security, compliance, the business goals, and procedures. Most security and compliance people have this sort of knee-jerk reaction, which is absolutist, right? It's either safe or it's not safe. Or I can figure out a scenario in which whatever the control is that you've put in place can be exploited. But sometimes perfect is the enemy of the good, right? So you want to be able to make incremental improvements that will help your business feel safer. And that is sort of, and given that the landscape of security is kind of ever changing, that's just a reality. There is no perfect solution anymore. What you can do is identify what's high value and start working on that as a group. So when you go and meet your security people, they're just going to blab all these acronyms, various controls, et cetera, at you, and it's going to feel like you're listening to a foreign language. And when we think about these standards, we often talk about them as like one name, right? We're SOC, SOC 2 compliant. We are, we've done ISO. We are HIPAA compliant, or we've used NIST. But it's actually this like cascading tree of stuff to do. And operations and security people look at this and it's like, oh my gosh, it's going to fill up my whiteboard. And so, what happens is many audit and compliance controls that we put in as operators and as security people kind of come from a bottom up. Like you see this one thing, it says, oh, well, I need to control or rotate my credentials every 30 days. So then you start with this like technical solution to this one thing, but you haven't created a process that sort of drives a greater security goals. And so then it ends up becoming this kind of like never-ending list of stuff to do. But it's an opportunity. So when you're faced with something like this, it's actually an opportunity to go back to the business and say, what kind of processes are we looking to put in place? What kind of behaviors are we looking to change? What is ultimately the goal of being able to control something like this? Is it to be able to accelerate adoption of new technology? Is it going to be to deliver more business value through faster deployment? How can we change the process so that we're not just tackling the technical spec of any one issue, but creating an organization that actually is compliant and is working towards mitigating risk? So this is where you start to bring DevOps is all about working together, about collaboration, about fast flow. You start bringing the compliance and security people into that fast flow, and that will help mitigate risk. So just to drive that point further, technology serves behavior. The technology isn't the solution. Everybody's knee-jerk reaction is, I'm just going to go buy something to fix that problem because they told me I need to do two-factor auth. That's not the way to go. It's really more about trying to drive behavior. And what you want to do is you want to be able to categorize your risk by severity and prevalence, right? What's a high prevalent, it's very common to get a splinter. Do we have public service announcements for splinters? No, we do have public service announcements for cigarette smoking because you have much more severe outcomes. So do some sort of risk calculation inside your organization to figure out what you want to focus on. So common threat actions are often in scope. So for example, access control issues are really common in most breaches. These are often usually inside of a regulatory scope, so it's definitely something you need to think about. Step 3 is to describe the risk and then propose mitigation. So if you're doing a regular review of access credentials, you have to talk with your business owners about what they feel are reasonable intervals. They might say once a quarter. They might say, you need to rotate them every day because we're constantly under attack by the Chinese. So then if you can run your control through the system, right, if the tool that you built or the process that you want or the behavior you're trying to achieve can get through this system, you can automate it. So one of the things you want to do is pick tools that work, that don't lock you into one floor provider, and because there's always more on the way. And then automate the process, or not. There are some things you may find are so sensitive that you really can only ever do that process through some sort of manual event, like a ticket. There are some things like provisioning, if you're working in a very highly compliant environment and you want to give someone access to the database credential, it may always be a one ticket, one person case. Sometimes you can actually automate it to provide gating functions, continuous logging of activities, be able to make dashboards and sort of show things at scale. Then you need to test it, right? Continuum security, I think, is downstairs. They use behavior-driven development processes to demonstrate various kinds of security controls. And teams that focus on testing early, they have better results from a security perspective, which means you're going to do better in an audit, which means you're going to be more compliant and have less risk in your business. So the last step, which is really the most important, is actually to take everything that you've done and everything you've controlled and all of your processes back to the business and tell them and inform them about how you're managing risk. Dumping JSON on someone's desk, probably not informative. Maybe coming up with some sort of example workflow or dashboard or another kind of tool that might overlay this would be much more informative to a business person. Finally, I have a website, 10factorci.com. It has a score and a checklist for securing your continuous development pipeline. It's an open source project. We'd love to have contributions, so feel free to check it out. So Gene Kim says, who's the author of the DevOps Audit Defense Kit, along with others, talks about how instead of spending our time trying to create the perfect system that never fails, let's instead create systems that are designed so we can detect problems early and fix them fast. And that's really part of the goal of the 10-Factor CI Job website. So once you've automated everything, you can go home, right? Well, there's always more. So really, you're trying to move through processes to make it increasingly automated. This is where kind of security planning process, et cetera, gets you toward the repeatable, adaptable security controls that are ultimately the goal for anyone who's got real risk they need to deal with in their business. So what happens after that? So you've automated everything. The robots are now controlling the robots. What's next? So for me, things I like to think about that are rather forward-looking are IoT and machine identity. I mean, think about this. If you work in a bank, you could have potentially a chatbot talking to another chatbot, right? So what does that mean? Well, we just got the people in business unit A who weren't supposed to talk to business unit B because of compliance reasons, locked down from, from people chat. Now I've got bots chatting bots. Like, how does that going to work? So these types of security controls are just getting more and more complicated and faster moving. And I think this is a really interesting area to start to think about things. And then finally, one other thing that I often think about and write about is AIs and access control. There's a huge opportunity for machine learning to help us understand better behavior and patterns of behavior in automated systems. I think what we're talking about ultimately is still just robotics and automation. When we have real AIs that can actually make decisions, and that's code writing code, I think that's going to be an incredibly interesting security and access control problem. So that's I think we're just at the beginning of starting to figure out how we're going to map automation and security practice to these fast-moving machines. So with that, I'll say thank you and ask if you have any questions. Afraid to talk to the compliance person, huh? Yes.
1, 2.
Yes, I'm sorry, I couldn't hear the last thing you said. Something and then scale.
I completely agree on the fact that everybody should talk together, Sec, Dev, and Ops.
And compliance.
And compliance, yes. It's great with small teams. How do you do that at big scale?
So really, this is about breaking down specific activities into functional groups, right? So if you have a big scale team, embedding security is a direction that companies are taking toward taking a person, embedding them in an app dev group as the security and compliance liaison back to a sort of central group. If you can come up with a way of distributing authority like that, central training, distributed authority, and enforcement, that actually scales out really nicely in large businesses.
Thank you.
Target does this, for example. After their breach, they did a huge organizational overhaul whereby they have now embedded security experts who are well-trained in PCI, which is the nature of their compliance strategy for all of their business units, not just the PCI compliant groups. They've embedded security and compliance people right into the app team, and only when they have a question or feel that they need to have an aberration or an exception from the policy do they go back to the central authority. Yes?
So my question is about how do you know, wait for the mic. Oh, sorry. Yes. So the question is, how do you assign responsibility for the risks that are being accepted? So I totally agree with the idea that and I'm from more the AppSec, kind of the development side of things. So I believe that we can't be the department of no. I think we should be the department of yes. So I like the idea of pollution, and we say, hey, here are the side effects of what you're doing. So we don't say don't do that. We just say, hey, there's a couple of roads here. Some are worse or better than others. How do you capture that? How do you make people accountable so that we can say yes, but there's a direct connection between the decisions being made?
So this is, again, where you need to, I mean, I think that the ultimate risk lies with the business owners, right? It could be your CFO, it could be your CEO, whomever it is. This, being able to understand and communicate out of a kind of coded system and into business language is, I think it's a gap that we're all trying to sort of transit. Because turning things into business terms is not something that DevOps and AppSec are necessarily very good at doing right now. So, you know, when we talk about this, you kind of have to frame it up in terms of like a public health event, right? So I think President Obama was talking about in Wired magazine about AIs, right? And you don't want to build big walls to prevent people from innovating, but you also need to look and see when the risks start to occur, how great they could potentially be. And so you don't want to have a scenario where the business doesn't understand the risks that you're taking, right? Or if you have, I mean, there's accountability, and then there's also the need to move fast and you know, deliver value, make money, etc. So turning this all into business terms is something that I think there's a lot of products that are starting to come to market to try and do that, essentially say, hey, you know, this is what our infrastructure looks like. These are the things I think we all need to be paying attention to. These are the things we view as lower risk.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Sorry, unfortunately, I've got to stop
Oh, yes.
here.
Thank you so much, everyone.